Welcome to another edition of the Thriving Dentist Show. I'm Gary Takish, your podcast co-host. If you're a longtime listener to the Thriving Dentist Show, you know we use a variety of different formats. And one of the formats that I use on the podcast is to bring a guest contributor who I interview for the podcast. And today is one of those episodes. And I have my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Henny, joining me today. And we're going to talk about the topic of co-discovery. Hey, Paul, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Gary. It's always a pleasure reconnecting with you, and we always have great conversations. So I'm looking forward to this.
You know, we do, and if you are a regular listener to the Thriving Dentist Show, you know that Paul has been a guest in the past. And we're going to explore a topic that is actually very timely. Now, if you're newer to the podcast and you're not familiar with Dr. Henny, let me take a minute and give your background. Paul, would you keep me honest as I give your background? And
absolutely.
Add to it? Paul is a practicing dentist in Roanoke, Virginia. He has a thriving practice, or one that I would certainly call a thriving practice in Roanoke, Virginia. And you have very much a relationship-driven, health-centered practice. Would you accept those adjectives to describe your practice?
Absolutely. That we very intentionally get to know with everybody that comes into our office, our practice very well, with the purpose of trying to connect with them on a deeper level that's kind of goal oriented and aligned around what they want to do.
Paul is also the founder of a wonderful Facebook group, a private Facebook group called the Bob Barkley Study Club. We'll talk more about that as we go through our interview today. You all need to know about that. If you're interested in this podcast, you will be deeply interested in the work that Paul does in the Bob Barkley Study Club on Facebook. Paul's also an educator. We've known each other for many, many, many years. I count him as a very dear friend and just an amazing colleague. We do some teaching together. Paul, did I hit the high points there in terms of the background?
I think that's probably all we need to take people through. We can touch on other things as we move forward if necessary.
Yeah, we're very much aligned philosophically, and the way we think about the behavioral side of dentistry. I feel like we have fantastic alignment on those topics for sure.
Absolutely, that we have been simpatico from day one. My first trip out to see you in Phoenix, I still remember very well.
Yeah, you bet. Well, we're going to talk about the concept of co-discovery, Paul, and I don't want to make any assumptions for our listeners. There may be some listeners that are hearing that topic for the first time, and there'll be listeners that are familiar with it and would like to learn more. Could you start with maybe a working definition of the concept of co-discovery?
Well, I think just on a word basis, co-discovery means learning with. So co-discovery, learning with, but it's much more than that, really. It's a mindset. It's a way of thinking about how we interact with other people, how we present information, and how effective we are, therefore, as teachers. And everybody knows that the origin of the word doctor is teacher. And one of the last things that we get any education on in dentistry is how to be a better teacher, when in fact, dentistry, as Bob Barkley said, dentistry is one of the most teaching of all professions. And I happen to agree with that. So, but none of us got any real sound education in how to educate. And we hardly even know how we learn well, much less how other people learn well. And that opens up a whole door that not very many dentists really have explored, but it's where really some profound changes can occur in your practice if you understand this territory better.
Yeah. Paul, you and I had a tremendous influence on our lives from Bob Barkley. But in the spirit of not making any assumptions here on this podcast episode, there may be some of our newer listeners that aren't familiar with Bob Barkley. Could you take a minute and introduce who Dr. Bob Barkley was and some of the concepts that have guided you and me and many others?
Yeah, Bob Barkley was a legend in dentistry back in the 60s and particularly in the 1970s. And he ended up writing a book called Successful Preventive Dental Practices that he published in 1972 that was wildly popular. And he toured the country, and he spoke oftentimes 8 to 9 times a month. And he did that year after year after year, all the way up until his untimely death in 1977 in a plane crash. Bob would speak to convention audiences sometimes as large as 3,000 people. He's a very dynamic speaker, and he focused really on two things: prevention, as well as communication and learning, or learning how other people learn, I guess you could say. And he connected the two things together because, as we've all experienced in dentistry, not that many, we show people what they need to do to take care of themselves better, but it's only a small percentage of those people that actually do it. And this was a riddle that Bob really worked on. And he figured out a way to connect with people to get his success rate up with people higher and higher. And what he realized was, once people became more healthy and they realized that actually they were in control of their health more, then the outcome of that was the people started choosing more and more fine dentistry. So it was a win-win situation, but it required him to invest on the front end and into essentially developing the person, developing the patient, deepening their understanding, clarifying their values and priorities, and then getting them to commit to certain concepts or ideas. And eventually they would sit down and develop a comprehensive treatment plan that might take a couple of years to execute, but they were always working together in a goal-oriented way. So Bob really was one of the first people that kind of created this goal-oriented relationship. And when I say that, I don't mean, me as a dentist imposing my views on you, Gary, the patient. I mean, you and Gary and I together sit down and decide what Gary wants long-term. How can we achieve that? How can we fit that into Gary's life? How can we make that work with Gary's budget and all these, realistic, real world issues? Bob pioneered all that stuff and traveled around the country and taught it. And it was an absolute phenomenon.
Now, he was doing this in his own practice, which, again, I want everyone to know was a small town in downstate Illinois that I think we could generously call it a one stoplight town. Would that be a good definition?
Yeah, and
where he practiced?
That brings up another relevant point, which is Bob Barkley was a student of Dr. Pankey, LD Pankey. And he trained under Dr. Pankey probably in the early 1960s. He started taking courses down directly from Dr. Pankey. This is before the Pankey Institute even existed. And he started taking courses down there, and he was absolutely convinced that this was the best way to practice. So he brought all these ideas back to Macomb, and Macomb was a town of about 10,000 people, small university there, mostly a farming community. You could drive 100 miles in either direction. It's flat as can be, nothing but cornfields. And so they were businesses and industries that basically were related to the farming industry at that time, and small farms. These are not corporate farms. So these were not wealthy people. These were middle class or lower people on average. And so Bob tried to bring Dr. Pankey's concepts into Macomb, and people financially, it wasn't within their paradigm, and it wasn't really within their culture either. The average person in Macomb by the time they reached the age of 60 had 6 remaining teeth in their mouth. So imagine the challenge of trying to convince somebody that's, let's say, 30 to change their mindset about their destiny in dentistry when everybody they know, everybody in their family, is either fully edentulous or well on their way. And their mindset is, my family has bad teeth. Why should I spend a lot of money on myself? That's my destiny too. So for Bob to overcome all of that mindset, that this thought in the majority of people's head that their destiny was to lose all their teeth anyways. Why should I spend all this money with Bob Barkley or whoever office they wandered into? Why should I do that? Why is that relevant to me? So to get around that hurdle, Bob did a tremendous amount of work in the area of psychology and learning and all kinds of things to help people reframe their perspective of dentistry and to see it in a more whole health perspective. So Bob was one of the pioneers, because of Dr. Pankey, in bringing a holistic perspective of dentistry relative to whole health into the profession. This is very, very new.
And I call all of that the behavioral side of dentistry. Really understanding the people side of dentistry, how people learn, how they process information. And one of the things I treasure about you, Paul, is how you have brought this information forward in relevant to the year 2023 and beyond. And that's, I know, one of your purposes with the private Facebook group is to really bring this information current and talk about how we can apply this and adapt it to the world of dentistry today. In so many ways, Bob Barkley was so far ahead of his time. I kind of feel like in many ways we're still trying to catch up to where he was at his untimely death.
That's absolutely true. When you look back, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about that is that very fact, Gary. When I started digging into this, what I found was some amazing findings. And most of the people that Bob developed these ideas from, they weren't just Joe Schmo off the street. Most of these people were PhDs. Most of them had PhDs in psychology. Many of them, like Charles Sorensen, had 3 PhDs. Some of the people that Bob was hanging around with and developing these ideas from were absolute geniuses.
They were always the smartest people in
yeah,
the room.
they what they were thinking about and what they were pioneering, it's hard to even get your head around it because it was so far ahead of where everybody else was at, let's say in 1968 or 1970 or 72. The stuff they were thinking about and the vision they had for dentistry was just absolutely progressive beyond belief. And they really saw a vision for dentistry moving away from this drill, fill, and bill mode and into being an integral part of a person's whole health, where the dentists work with them in a collaborative way to eliminate disease and create an optimal outcome for them so that they could live on into their 60s and 70s and have a full dentition and smile with pride and not be embarrassed by dentures that are halfway falling out of their mouth like everybody else was at that time. So like I said, that was a pretty aggressive view of the future. If you look at the average person walking down the sidewalk in downtown Macomb in 1968 or 1970.
Right. Now, if I think about how most dentists are taught case presentation, going back to dental school, I think what most dentists have been taught is a model of identify a problem and present a solution. Now, I'm being very simplistic, but would that have been your experience in dental school, Paul?
Yeah, I think pretty much the vast majority of us, with maybe a few exceptions of people that maybe were at the University of Texas in the 70s, which actually had a behavioral dentistry department.
Right.
With just a few exceptions like that. Most of us got kind of we're taught kind of a show, tell, do method of trying to proceed forward with dentistry. And of course, when you're in a dental school environment, that works because the patient's there because they're paying nothing or next to nothing. And they're going to go along with whatever you say because that's the framework of the relationship. And certainly what happened to me when I left dental school and most of us, when we left dental schools, we quickly realized that the real world doesn't work like that. People don't function based entirely on logic, and they don't necessarily respond to people positively just because they're in a position of authority or even knowledge. That's not what people do because that's not the way the human mind works. And so we were all struggling with that, myself in particular. So when I ran into Bob Barkley's work, he was talking about this in a way that completely resonated with me. He was explaining problems that I experienced exactly the way I was experiencing them. So it made me very curious about, who is this guy? Where did this information come from? How do I get more of it? How do I learn how to apply it in my practice? And I've been able to do that now for over 30 years, 35 years. And it changes the complete dynamic of the way you practice dentistry, when pretty much everybody that's coming in the door is almost a friend of yours. And every interaction is kind of intimate on that level.
Well, I've had the privilege of visiting your office in Roanoke, Virginia, and of course, I understand a bit about your practice from our friendship. Share with our listeners more about your practice.
Well, I had a vision for the facility that I work in right now. Is a facility, a building that I built in the year 2001. It was a concept that lived in my mind for close to 10 years before that. So for 10 years, I was constructing this office building and the systems, and even imagining the people who would work in it, and even imagining the patients who would come to me. I would do that. So I would envision kind of myself, I would place myself in this new building, and I could see myself working in it, and I could see myself interacting with my team, and I could see how the patients responded to it. And eventually I actually built it. I took it out of my mind, and I took what I could figure out over to an architect that was nearby, and we drew it out and we built it. And that's what you saw, Gary. My office is intentionally designed kind of be more like a home, particularly the front end of it. And I wanted to avoid as much as possible any kind of feelings that they were entering a dental office. I wanted them to feel like they were entering my home. So the way I furnished it, all every details on the wall, everything, I wanted that to trigger positive memories in their mind, and to avoid, sales pitches or anything like that. So my original intention was just to create a bond. So let me give you an example. All over my office are black and white photographs from the golden era of Hollywood. And I just love old photography of, Clark Gable or whatever. And in my bathroom, the walls are covered with these photographs, like you would see in the old time hotels of the 60s and 50s, if you ever did that, maybe in the old hotels of Chicago. So I always liked that look, because I could just sit there and look at the photographs, and that's what happens.
Quite elegant. There was a elegance.
Yes. Yeah. And today, interesting thing, I have a picture of a photograph of the Wizard of Oz in there. Dorothy, the Tin Man, and the Straw Man, and they're holding hands, and they're dancing down the yellow brick road. And there's a photograph, black and white photograph, in my bathroom. And the patient came out of the bathroom. She said, I would like to get a photograph like that. Can you tell me like that? I've decorated my guest bedroom in my house is decorated in the Wizard of Oz. So immediately we had a connection. So that's been, it's been very helpful and strategic. I mean, it's a passion of mine anyways. I love that old photography, but it's a way for us to begin a conversation in a safe place, that we can share some common memories about, things that we saw growing up, or movies that we watched, or movie stars that we really admired. So it's been very effective. And so that's kind of what I did.
Well, you have a diverse patient base too,
Yes.
from, young adults to seniors, and everyone in between.
Yes.
And, I can imagine that, people find just some comfort being in your office, just by the way
they literally comment on that almost every day. And that's been happening for over 20 years now.
Yeah.
So people will come in the door and they will just say, well, the first thing they'll say is, who designed this office? And they'll usually will ask Amy about that.
Yeah.
But she'll be the first person they'll meet. And she goes, well, Dr. Henny did that. So there's a lot of power, and that's another side conversation, but there's a lot of power in you putting some of yourself into the design of your facility and how it feels.
Right. Right.
And because they gain some perspective from that. They gain your sense of artistic talent and touch and your interests. And Charlie Verapapi did something very similar to his place, a very, very elegant office. Johnson Haga did the same thing. It has his own artwork. His own artwork is on the walls all over his office. Right. So it's a very personalized experience when you walk in the door. So I think that's the central idea to take away on that one.
Well, which really leads me to a core element that I feel very strongly about. And I know you do, and I know that it's evolved from the work of Bob Barkley and Dr. L.D. Pankey, but it's the idea of being relationship driven. Would you share some of your thoughts about what a practice that is relationship driven? How do they, how do they represent that to their patients?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to think, what's so special about being relationship driven? I mean, don't you have a relationship with the checkout person at the grocery store, or don't you have a relationship with the person that owns the bakery down the street? And so what I really think is important to understand is that we're talking about a lot more than good rapport. We're talking about a lot more than being nice to each other and courteous. When I talk about being relationship driven, what we're really talking about is knowing the person on a much deeper level, in a way that I understand you. Let's say you, Gary, are my patient. My goal is to understand who Gary is and what Gary's priorities are, and what's really, really important to Gary, particularly related to dentistry. And so that any planning that I do later on, after we've finished examinations and had conversations, any planning that I do is in alignment with Gary's expectations and Gary's priorities. And when you co-create plans with patients, the outcome is they always say yes. How are they going to say no to something they helped create? That's sort of the equivalent of the architect drawing up my building and me coming back and say, no, I don't want to do that. That's not going to happen.
Right.
So the goal is to get farther enough down the road relationship wise that you can sit down at a table and plan their future. Bob Barkley used to call that success planning. And I love that phrase, success planning. Let's sit down and put together a success plan that takes you from where you are now to on into the future when you're 70. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about how things are trending now and what that will mean 10, 20 years from now? Does that concern you? And so that's sort of the way Bob worked with patients.
Yeah. And the sad reality is that the healthcare model, I'm talking about medical healthcare model that we have today, has really gone very much away from that. And yet in dentistry, we can still be very relationship driven. But I think the healthcare model and how broken it is also presents a tremendous opportunity for us, because frankly, the bar is pretty low.
No question about it.
As we're recording this, just for audience benefit, Paul and I are seeing each other here on Zoom, and I see you smile when I say the bar is set low. Yeah. And it's a sad comment on healthcare, but it presents opportunity for us in dentistry. Comment on that if you would, Paul.
Well, let me put it this way. It's an opportunity you could drive a truck through. You just have to be aware of it. You have to be able to see it, and you have to be able to understand that, because we live in a very depersonalized world. And I know everybody that's listening to this podcast understands that. It used to be that you would go to the store and you would know everybody there. It used to be that you would take your car to a place where you knew everybody that worked there. It used to be that you went to the school and you knew everybody there. Our society's gotten so atomized that we hardly know anybody anymore. And the people that we do know, we're not so sure we can trust them.
Yeah. You know,
So
if you're of a particular vintage, like some of us are, we might even remember where you could go to a restaurant and have a tab.
yeah, right.
Because we knew the owner of the restaurant, and we were trusted patrons of the restaurant, and we could run a tab and settle that tab on occasion. And
Or you would sit down and they would just bring out what they knew already that you would have ordered. I
yeah,
mean, yeah, I mean that those are times, unfortunately, long gone. But therein lies the opportunity. However, that tragedy opens the door to a big opportunity, which is dentistry. Because of if we choose to structure our practice this way, dentistry becomes an unbelievable opportunity to connect with people and help with them on a deep, significant level that literally will change their life. And that's not hyperbole.
and I would suggest, Paul, that that reality that you just described is what makes dentistry really so fulfilling for dentists. Is the connection you have with them and the way you've been able to influence their lives is in such a positive way.
Yeah. And, medicine used to be like that, when the doctor used to come to the home and knew the family and knew the environment and knew the economic circumstances they were under and all of that. But dentistry is really one of the only places left where you can do that. Name another one. It's not physical therapy. It's not pharmacy. It's not speech therapy. It's none of these things,
Yeah.
And so, dentistry, again, you have to choose that, and you have to in a conscious way, create that situation. Or you can just unconsciously recreate the mill that exists in medicine and a lot of other dental practices today. It's up to you. But that's the wonderful thing about dentistry. You do have a choice how you go about doing this. Hence, you have a choice about how you're going to live your life, because the majority of your life is going to be spent in a dental office, assuming that you stay healthy and are willing to practice. And, I always thought if I could create a practice situation that I really enjoyed it, then I would never really want to retire. And then I could just retire when I just felt like I was ready. And so every year it becomes more fun to me, really, to practice. So now I understand why some dentists choose to continue practicing even into their 70s when they don't have to. They can retire, but they gain so much interpersonally out of being there and helping people that they continue to do that long past the point of retirement.
And Paul, I know, because of our relationship, I know that your early days in practice right out of University of Michigan were not the way you practice today. Would you mind sharing a little bit of that experience early on?
No, I mean, I've been on the low road, so to speak. I mean, I've been an associate in a practice. I've sat there with an empty schedule. I've been an associate in another practice where they weren't collecting on all the work that I was doing. So I was working my behind off, and I wasn't getting paid. And it led me to the point where I thought, if I don't take charge of this situation myself, I'm always going to be miserable, or I'm just going to have to get out of dentistry, one or the other, because this situation is, to me, intolerable.
Well, and the audience knows my feelings about participating with insurance, and in particular PPO models. And you had some of that experience early in your career as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, these were insurance centered practices, and I can remember my very first associateship that I was in. A guy named Ron ran the practice, and he brought me in as an associate, but he really didn't have enough patients to keep my schedule full. So I was standing around a lot of the time, and a lot of times I would just grab a cup of coffee and stand in the laboratory, and I would look up at the shelves, and there were all these crowns and bridges sitting up there. But the funny thing about it, the dates on them were like 2 and 3 years old. And I said, Ron, what's the story on all this dentistry in the lab that isn't delivered? And he said, well, they didn't want to make the copayment. which, for somebody that was just a couple years out of dental school, that was like the most crazy, illogical thing that you could ever say. Why would somebody not want to finish their dentistry just because of a few dollars? And in fact, again, we come back to human behavior is not logical a lot of the times. The way people behave and the way people make decisions, unless we assume a more effective leadership role in influencing them, they make crazy decisions that are not helpful for either one of us.
Well, you just gave me a fantastic transition point. And that is, I know in the work that we do together, we talk about the role of neuroscience in dentistry today. Now, that may be new to some of our listeners. Would you give us a little bit of neuroscience 101 and co-discovery here together, Paul? Kind of maybe create some intrigue and interest among our listeners?
Sure. I mean, the very simplest way to think about it is that each of us essentially has 3 brains. You could probably argue that we have 4 brains. You could argue that we have a functionally a brain stem. We have a midbrain, and then we have a right and a left hemisphere. So really, we kind of have 4 brains. And from an evolutionary biology standpoint, those evolved at different times. And because they evolved at different times, the lower brains, if you will, tend to be able to predominate over the higher brain functioning. So this is why fear is such a powerful force. You can get people to do all kinds of things if you keep them afraid, or if they are afraid. You can manipulate people around very easily. This is something that Adolf Hitler figured out how to do, and many other people. Fear is a midbrain function. It's primarily driven by our amygdala. And guess what a lot of people are afraid of, Gary? What one place do they really don't like, not like to go to?
I know this one, Paul. I know this one. And so, that would absolutely be the dental office.
Yeah. So, if people are coming into our environment afraid, their force fields are up, if you will, and their capacity to learn is very, very diminished, because even though it's not on the conscious level, in the back of their mind, they're going, okay, what do I need to do to make this as short as possible and get out of here as fast as possible? That is absolutely the opposite kind of mindset that we need a person to be in if we want them to learn more about their situation and make better decisions. Hence, we go back to the Wizard of Oz photograph and things like that. Okay. So we need to think about what people are thinking and feeling when they come into our environment, because we got to manage down the lower brain functions so that their upper brain functions, particularly their prefrontal cortex, is looking at the situation and thinking something like, this is a very different experience. I'm really kind of enjoying this. I've never had conversations like this with a dentist before. I've never had anybody spend that kind of quality time with me. It really kind of seems like this person cares who I am as a person. Could this maybe I can redefine what dentistry is in my life. This is because of this experience. So that's how we change over time, as we challenge our previous belief systems and they're replaced by updated information. But the updated information can't get in there if we're in a state of fear or we're distracted. And so many dental offices today are just so high speed, low touch, high delegation, that the person doesn't really develop a relationship with anybody that feels safe, and creates a situation where the person's going to maybe open up and really share what their real concerns are or what their real issues are.
Right. I think we all remember tidbits of high school biology where we learned about the autonomic nervous system and the functionality of different parts of our brain when we were either in fight or flight, or the other side, rest and digest.
Yes.
And, you think about the world we're in today, Paul, even in a lovely town like Roanoke, Virginia, people driving around in the roads around Roanoke, Virginia are almost always in some degree of fight or flight. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a major highway that runs through here with a lot of semi trucks, and it's virtually every day. Because I have a lot of patients that come to me sometimes, from hundreds of miles away, so they've got to get on this highway, and it's
Yeah.
very stressful. So it's actually a very regular conversation that I have. Was how was your drive in? Was it very stressful? And usually they will say yes.
And then I think it's fair to say that in the dental office for the public, not necessarily for you or I, but for the public, pretty much every person in the dental office, at least the first visit, is subconsciously in a position of fight or flight. Would you agree with that?
I think that's the safest assumption. I think that's where we need to think they are.
And subconsciously, they're not necessarily
Yeah.
consciously choosing that, because
Right.
perhaps they've been referred by someone
Yes.
who they love and trust. But subconsciously, they're probably in a position of fight or flight, versus the other side, which is rest and digest. Talk about rest and digest.
Well, rest and digest is parasympathetic nervous system driven. And it's not possible until our sympathetic nervous system is settled down. So, and it's really only when we're in the rest and digest mode, that's when we're really capable of learning the most. That's when we're paying more attention to the environment. That's when you're laying down in the field of grass with the spring flowers around you, and you're looking around and you're just seeing things that you've never seen before. You're finally paying attention. Yeah.
I politely suggest the patient in the restroom seeing a picture of
Yes.
Of the Wizard of Oz and being transported to a feeling of rest and digest and familiarity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So these are all little kind of strategic things that you need to be aware of and you can deploy. There's a time to talk about teeth, and there's times to just build a relationship. And one of my favorite lines from Bob Barkley is, build your relationships first, then build your dentistry. And if you keep things in that order, then things work out much, much better for you. And what I mean by that is you can have a practice that is fairly low volume in terms of number of people that you need to see in a day, but your productivity per patient is astronomical, because you're doing bigger cases in organized way and the patient's on board with it. They help plan it. They're excited about it. They're taking care of everything. And you're both just ecstatic when the case is finished. I just saw a case today that came back for a follow-up, and we've been working on it for, I'd say 8 months, because it was a complete implant reconstruction, and we finally got to deliver the prosthesis a couple of weeks ago. So I'm at the follow-up now, but it was a tough, grueling road, but he was totally on board with it. And he was so happy today. I asked him, I said, how's everybody feeling about that smile? And he just looked at me and just gave me the biggest grin. And he was so happy. And that's like that payoff is like worth more than the money. You know what I mean, Gary?
Yeah.
I could see, I mean, I literally
100%.
I literally changed this guy's life for the better.
Yeah.
And, that's like the payoff moment,
Yeah. Paul, there's, we're going to barely glance on the surface of this today. There's so much we could cover about the concept of co-discovery and relationship driven and neuroscience and dentistry. But I want to send our listeners out with some things they can do immediately to kind of get started down this path. And of course, I'm going to direct anyone that's listening to this needs to be a member of the Bob Barkley Study Club, your Facebook group. That's a private group, but if you request admittance, say you listen to Paul on the Thriving Dentist Show, I think you'll let him in as a member. Is that correct, Paul?
Yeah. If you just query for Bob Barkley Study Club, you'll find us.
Yeah. Look, I'll put a link in the show notes so you can click that link and you'll go to that page. But I know you publish a wealth of information, on the Bob Barkley Study Club about how to apply these concepts in your practice. Can I put you on the spot for just a second, Paul? We didn't talk about it ahead of time, but
yeah.
And again, I'm not suggesting that any of this is simple. It's complex, but we can get there step by step. What are some ways that a listener might start to apply co-discovery in their practice? And I want them to learn a lot more about it, but I really want to have our listeners be able to experience some of this, rather quickly in their practice. What are some ways they can start to incorporate this, in their practice tomorrow?
Well, I think the one of the key distinctions of co-discovery, it's not show tell do. It's not, I got a camera, let me show you this. We need to do a crown. That's not co-discovery. What co-discovery is perhaps showing a photograph and not saying a word, waiting for their response, and that might be another minute. But you would be shocked at what people will come up with and what they'll say. They'll say something, boy, that looks really bad, doesn't it? Do you think you can save that? And so you wait. What you're doing is you're waiting for them to process that a little bit in their mind and come up with the meaning of what they're seeing and what they're learning. And from there, then you go forward. Then you make another comment. Well, yes, I believe we can. There's still, as bad as it looks, there's actually still a lot of structure there. And the key thing is to get in and save the situation before it gets too far down the road where we can't. And so that's just a small little snippet of co-discovery. It's waiting for the learning moment, I guess you would say, or creating circumstances where a person is perceiving something and you let them verbalize the meaning of that perception. Another example would be just doing a muscle palpation on a patient. Maybe a patient has some TMD symptoms, and they have some really hot masseters and pterygoids, temporalis perhaps. And you gently palpate those muscle areas and you ask them what they're feeling. And you ask them how long that's has been going on. And you might change one thing or two, and you might ask them, does this feel better if I do that? And so that's kind of working with them more on the emotional level. And you're allowing them to kind of process what they're experiencing and putting more relevance to it. Because relevance is the thing. If what is being discussed is not relevant to the person, you might as well be just whistling Dixie down the alleyway. You're wasting your time, right?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And yet the right amount of listening and the right questions can be very useful in the co-discovery process.
Yeah, it's all Mary Osborne's got a phrase that I love. It's called staying in the question.
Yeah.
Which means probing for what it really means to me anyways, is means probing for the backstory. Because a lot of times people don't really tell you what they mean the first time they respond. They may be strategic trying to avoid what they want to say or how they feel. And sometimes, and this is really kind of the power of an effective relationship with a person, sometimes it'll take an appointment or two or three before a person finally opens up and shares with you what was really bothering them. I had that happen to me with a patient who I was about ready to begin a crown preparation, and I had successfully anesthetized her gently, and she just started to weep. And I stopped. And we hadn't begun yet. And I sat her up and I said, can you tell me more about what's going on in your mind? What's happening? And it was at that point, and now I'd seen this patient 3 or 4 times before. And she finally told me the story of her kind of being abused by a dentist. And they had done a crown on her, and somehow the impression material got stuck in there and they hardly could get it out. And she thought she was not going to be able to live through it. She couldn't breathe. And this was deeply impregnated in her memory. And so I had to stop and reassure her that that was not going to happen to her again, that she was safe and that I was going to look out for her and that we were going to get through this. And by the time we finished, the the crown went in, she looked at me and just kind of smiled. And she said, that was a lot better than I thought it was going to be. And, that was a conversation that she just wasn't ready to share with me. And up until the very last moment. And that's when I got it. But I had the presence of mind to stop and listen to her and deal with it, because it was a big, big deal to her.
So slowing down and being more perceptive are important factors for sure.
Yeah.
And, the drill, fill, and bill practice model that many practices have really work against that, don't they? In fact, I would say a PPO practice model really in every way, shape, and form takes you away from being relationship driven.
Yeah. I mean, everything is so focused on production per hour that you kind of, I think anyways, lose sight of the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
As I said, you can be much, you can't imagine how much more productive you can be if you slow down and work with a smaller group of people who appreciate you and what you can do for them. They will spend a factor of 10 more dollars with you, and they will do it. As Avram King used to say, they will do it spending happy dollars. They will gladly trade their money for what you can do for them. And I think as a dentist, we all want that situation. We want some level of appreciation for how hard we work, because we really do. We work in a profession where we don't get that much back. If particularly if we work in a more traditional practice environment, we don't get that much positive feedback. We look at our reviews, Google reviews or something like that, and one's bad out of 50 and our heart is broken or something.
Yeah.
And it's kind of ridiculous. But that's kind of how dentistry goes. And this type of practice is so much more gratifying that it's something to really seriously look at and think about.
Paul, you've just completed a major project. You've authored a book. And I have the privilege of doing kind of advanced reading of the book. I'm enjoying the heck out of it. The working title as of now is called Co-Discovery: Exploring the Life and Legacy of Bob Barkley. And I am enjoying the heck out of my advanced reading. Talk a little bit about the book. And, I know we don't have exact publishing dates yet, but it's coming up. Talk a little bit about your book.
Well, this is a book that I've been working on for at least 7 years, believe it or not, and off and on. And assembling things. I talked earlier about just sort of my journey of going deeper and deeper and finding these people that had 1, 2, and 3 PhDs plus a couple master's degrees thrown in for good measure. And I just kept bumping into all these amazing people that were massive contributors to the advancement of dentistry back in the 60s and the 70s in particular. Very, very fertile time. And I decided that what really needed to happen was somebody needed to collect all this together in an organized way so that a person could sit down and read through it and gather all these gems that these people had created and gifted to us that we still have available today. I mean, it is very accurate for me to say that the way I practice today is related to the work that people did 50 years ago. That's not a distortion. The pioneering work that these people did 50 years ago is what allows me to do what I do today much more effectively. And that's an odd thing to say in our rapidly progressive world with our high tech and this and that. When it comes to the personal side of dentistry, the behavioral side of dentistry, human beings haven't changed too much over the last 100 million years, or whatever, how long we have 20 million years, or how long humans been on this planet. Emotionally, we're about the same. We think in similar ways. We come to conclusions in different ways. Granted, we're bombarded with a whole lot more information now, which makes the decision-making process a lot more difficult. Yeah. But the brain hasn't changed too much.
And I'd argue it's more relevant than ever today.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to finding meaning in your work.
And so we're circling back to my earlier comments about, when we're in dental school, we really didn't learn much about we didn't learn much about how to be better educators. And that's really a game of the minds.
Yeah.
And so you really need to understand how the mind works. You need to understand how your mind works. That's the beginning. That's step one. And then once you kind of understand how your mind works and how you use it and how you learn and your preferences in learning, then you can start to reach out and understand other people better and help them with their learning. Learn how others learn, which is all the landscape that Bob Barkley and all these people were involved in. So that's what my book is about, or Bob Barkley and all these people that had such a tremendous impact on the trajectory of person-centered, what I would call person-centered dentistry.
Yeah. Well, I know all of our listeners will treasure your book, and I know as of right now, we're looking at perhaps a late spring publication. Does that sound about
Hopefully
right?
so, late spring or
Late
summer.
spring. I'll let you know here on the podcast when it's available and where you can get it, but it's titled Co-Discovery: Exploring the Life and Legacy of Bob Barkley. And I'm excited to be reviewing it. And it is fantastic, Paul. It's really, I really appreciate the effort you put into this and the synthesis of so many leaders in our profession, and bringing it forward into 2023 and beyond is so exciting. I kind of see this as, in many Native traditions, there's the story of the oral tradition, and the stories and the experiences people have. And I know that many Native American people feel like they can't let that information die. We've got to carry it forward, and we've got to adapt it moving forward. And I see you very much doing the same thing to our wonderful profession by bringing this information forward, contemporizing it, and talking about how it can be adapted and applied even more relevantly today. And it's profound. Well, as we come into the finish line today, Paul, I'd like to announce that you and I have a workshop coming up. You and I have had the privilege of teaching together a number of times, and we've taught a co-discovery workshop together now a number of times. And you've built a facility for that workshop that we had a chance to test drive last fall. And I'm excited that we have another co-discovery workshop coming up relatively soon. Talk about that workshop.
Yes, in April 28th and 29th of this year, Gary and I are going to host another co-discovery workshop. This is a kind of a small gathering of people that are interested in learning more about some of these ideas that we've been talking about over the last half an hour or so. What is co-discovery? How do you apply that? Where do these ideas come from? How does the mind work?
Now, it's very deliberately designed in not only its content, but in the format of being a relatively small group.
Yes, it's very much discussion oriented, because really at the end of the day, the last thing I want to do is an information dump that you're going to not be able to take home and apply. So we're available to help you think through how you're going to apply some of these changes into your practice. How can I slow down enough to do some of these things that Paul's talking about? How do I do that? How can I rearrange my schedule? How can I reorganize some of my key practice systems to make this happen more and more often? Because it's not like you just walk in on Monday and turn the switch and all of a sudden you've got a different practice. This is a progression of changes that you integrate over time. And as you learn more, you get better and better at it. And but you've got to have that conception in your mind, kind of like I did in the very beginning. What is it that I'm trying to create here? That's step one for sure.
Now, I've had the privilege of teaching in some wonderful postgraduate facilities, Pankey Institute being but one of those. But I have to say, Paul, the facility you've designed on your property is just amazing in its vision and scope and environment. It really creates an environment for learning that would be hard pressed to duplicate anywhere else. And I know you spent a massive amount of time and effort in designing that facility to produce that kind of result?
Yeah, I mean, I literally have created a mountaintop learning center that is mostly all glass, and that has vistas that you can look out for close to 10 miles in most directions. And it's intentionally there because this type of work is heavy on self-reflection. So it's the kind of place where you can have a discussion about an important topic, and then we can break up and you can walk outside and take a little walk around the property and think about it. Think about how that could work in your life. Think about what changes you would need or new people you'd have to hire, whatever facility changes, because you really need, that's the relevant part. You got to get this thing off the chalkboard, and you got to get it into your life. Thinking about it, oh, wouldn't it be nice someday if, isn't enough.
Right.
You need an action plan.
Right.
So the facility is set up to support that, facilitate that kind of time. And it's very helpful for attendees to talk to each other about the struggles they're having. It's not just Gary and I, the oracles standing up on the mountaintop professing all the golden rules. It's really about us putting out ideas and letting the group discuss them and talk through the application challenges.
We've done that a number of different times in different locations around the country, and every time it has been just an incredible experience all the way around. The fellowship, the meals we've shared together, the learning has just been exquisite all the way around. Where would be a good place for any of our listeners to go to get more information about that upcoming workshop? It is April 28th and 29th. Perhaps sending you an email. Would that be
you can send me an email at paul@paulhennydds.com, paulhennydds.com. You can also contact me at paul@codiscovery.com, paul@codiscovery.com, no hyphen.
We'll put both of those email addresses in the show notes if you need them. But again, paul@paulhenney.com or
paulhennydds,
paulhennydds.com, I'm sorry. And paul@codiscovery.com.
Right.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about is really kind of a full immersion experience where, we're pretty close together for a couple days and a couple dinners together and lunches and everything. And it's very insightful and productive and meaningful, emotional. And I really want to thank you, Gary, for helping me do this work. It's really important work.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you on this. It's some of the most enjoyable time I get to spend every year. And I'm very, very excited about it. Well, come join us coming up April 28th and 29th, the Co-Discovery Workshop. We'd love to have you come join us. It is a small group, and that's done intentionally to get the most learning opportunity out of that. Well, Paul, I want to take a minute and thank you for spending some time with me today and sharing your wisdom with our listeners. I want to thank you for all the amazing work that you do with the Bob Barkley Study Club. I know this book has been quite literally a labor of love for you, and it's exciting to see it coming to the finish line here.
Yeah, it's going to be a relief, I think, to finally have this thing. When you write a book, if you've ever done this sort of thing, it lives in your brain, and you sort of long for the day where you can get it out of there and put it over there on the shelf so you can start thinking about other things. So I'm looking for that feeling here pretty soon.
Well, and I'll suggest that it will make a massive difference for anyone that takes the time to digest it. It will make a massive difference in your life for sure. Well, I also want to take a minute and thank all of our listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you here at the Thriving Dentist Show. In the spirit of being relationship driven, I have a request. If you like the work that we're doing here at the Thriving Dentist Show, if you'd be kind enough to share it with a friend and let them know about the Thriving Dentist Show, that would be much appreciated. On that note, let me simply thank you for the privilege of your time and tell you that I'll look forward to connecting with you on the next Thriving Dentist Show.